I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the desk. I didn't send a dramatic resignation email at midnight. I simply placed my employee badge on the glass surface of my boss's desk, nodded once, and walked out. 24 hours later, 19 executives were terminated. If you think this is a story about emotions, you're wrong. This is a story about data, about timestamps, about files that people assumed were gone forever, and about a woman who quietly built a system so airtight that dismantling it with a PowerPoint deck was never going to work. My name is Rachel Monroe, and for 15 years, I made sure my company stayed on the right side of the law, even when it desperately wanted to cut corners. I was 42 years old, head of compliance at Arrogance Systems, a publicly traded financial services firm that prided itself on innovation and speed. I had survived 3 mergers, 2 recessions, and 1 hostile takeover. I'd testified before regulators, sat across from federal auditors, and once spent an entire Christmas Eve rewriting policies to prevent a multi-million-dollar fine. I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong. That Tuesday morning in March, I arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours earlier than usual. The glass tower reflected the pre-dawn darkness like a mirror that didn't want to tell the truth. My badge beeped at the security gate, the same 3-tone sound I'd heard thousands of times before. It would be the last time. Marcus, the overnight security guard, looked up from his crossword and smiled. "Early start, Ms. Monroe." "Something like that," I said. The executive floor was empty, exactly as I'd planned. My heels echoed across the marble, each step measured, deliberate. I didn't turn on the lights in my office. I sat in the dark, watching the city wake up through the floor-to-ceiling windows, thinking about how invisible good systems are when they work, and how panicked people become when they realize they don't understand them. My desk was already clear. I'd been preparing for weeks, quietly, methodically. The new leadership thought I was cooperating. They had no idea I was documenting everything. At 7:45 a.m., I heard the elevator doors open and a voice that carried far too well for a professional setting. Tyler Graves. 31 years old. Harvard MBA. Newly appointed Chief Transformation Officer. Also, the CEO's son. He had a habit of announcing himself like he was stepping onto a stage. 3 weeks into his tenure, he'd already reorganized our reporting structure twice and used the word disruption in every sentence. I stood, straightened my jacket, and picked up my employee badge. It felt heavier than it should have, maybe because of what it represented. Access. Trust. 15 years of institutional knowledge. Tyler's corner office was 3 doors down from mine. His door was open. Inside, he was arranging printed slides on his desk, colorful diagrams about efficiency paradigms and agile governance. I knocked once and walked in. "Rachel," he said, smiling without warmth. "You're early. Did you see my email about streamlining compliance?" I placed my badge on his desk, directly on top of his slides. The plastic made a soft click against the glass. He stared at it, then looked up. "Is there an issue with your access?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm leaving." He leaned back in his chair, clearly amused. "Leaving? You know you need to give notice." "Actually, I don't," I replied. Senior executives can resign immediately during fundamental restructuring. Section 47, Paragraph 4. I wrote that contract. His smile faded. "You can't just walk out. You have responsibilities." "Past tense," I said. I turned toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. You might want to review the continuity protocols. Especially the parts about system access and succession. Just a friendly suggestion." I left him sitting there, still holding my badge, surrounded by slides that suddenly looked very small. In the hallway, I passed Janet from legal, her arms full of folders. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Rachel, I heard voices. No shouting, I said. Just clarity. I walked past conference rooms where I'd spent years stopping bad ideas before they became indictments. Past the break room where I'd mentored analysts who now knew more about regulatory law than most executives. In the elevator, I pulled out my phone and sent a single text to my attorney. It's done. File at 9 a.m. The doors closed. 15 years reduced to a 30-second descent. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was prepared. As I crossed the lobby, Marcus called out, "Have a good day, Ms. Monroe." I smiled. I will. Outside, the morning sun felt almost theatrical. Somewhere behind me, people were opening emails, checking calendars, preparing for meetings. They had no idea that the systems they'd ignored were about to notice them. 3 weeks earlier, the unraveling had already begun. It started, as these things often do, with a late-night email on a Sunday. Effective immediately, Tyler Graves will assume the role of Chief Transformation Officer, reporting directly to CEO Robert Graves. Nepotism dressed up as progress. Tyler's resume was glossy, carefully curated, and noticeably silent about his 2 failed startups and the regulatory investigation that followed one of them. But when your father controls a large block of board votes, omissions become irrelevant. Monday brought the first casualties. Our CFO of 8 years arrived to find her badge deactivated. By noon, she was gone, replaced by someone who'd shared a dorm room with Tyler in business school. By Wednesday, legal and risk management were being reassigned. The pattern was obvious. I was excluded from meetings that directly affected compliance. When I walked into one anyway, binder in hand, Tyler smiled and said, "This is a closed session." "Compliance is required for any structural change," I replied, sitting down. Section 12 of Corporate Governance. The room went quiet. Tyler called it old thinking. I called it federal law. That was when I started copying files. Not stealing. Preserving. Every approval trail. Every exception. Every override. I worked early mornings and late nights. Security noticed but didn't ask questions. To them, I was still Rachel Monroe, the woman who'd kept the company out of trouble for over a decade. On Thursday evening, I found it. A folder buried deep in the shared drive. Project Phoenix. Inside were documents outlining plans to bypass compliance checks, outsource oversight to a shell company, and retroactively justify decisions after the fact. Transformation, they called it. I called it evidence. By Friday, my team was panicking. "What does right-sizing mean?" one analyst asked. "It means update your resume," I said. That night, Tyler found me still working. "You don't have to be the enemy," he said. "You could be part of this." I looked at him and finally understood. He didn't see risk. He didn't see consequences. He saw obstacles. That's when I knew how it would end. Because systems don't care about confidence. They care about inputs. And I had been quietly setting those inputs for years. By the time Tyler realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Systems don't announce themselves when they activate. They don't send warnings or dramatic countdowns. They simply begin doing what they were designed to do. At 9:03 a.m., exactly 3 minutes after my attorney filed the paperwork documenting my immediate resignation under restructuring clauses, Arcan's internal continuity framework shifted from passive monitoring to active verification. Tyler didn't know that term. He had skimmed past it years ago, assuming it was bureaucratic padding. He had never asked why it existed, who designed it, or what conditions triggered it. That was his mistake. At 9:17 a.m., the first automated compliance audit began. Quietly. Invisibly. It cross-checked vendor approvals from the past 90 days against historical authorization patterns. At 9:22, it flagged inconsistencies. At 9:31, it escalated those flags to the internal audit queue. At 9:44, the system initiated mandatory preservation protocols, locking transaction logs, metadata trails, and approval histories across finance, procurement, and IT. Nobody noticed. Tyler was in a meeting, pacing in front of a screen, explaining to a room full of eager executives how governance was an outdated concept. At 10:06 a.m., my phone buzzed. A single word from my attorney. Filed. I was sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, watching people rush past with lattes and briefcases, living their ordinary lives. I took a sip of coffee and felt something close to calm. Because now, it wasn't about me anymore. It was about the data. At 10:38 a.m., Internal Audit received its first system-generated alert. Not from a person. From the framework itself. Vendor approval anomalies exceeding threshold. Conflict of interest probability high. Recommended action, initiate forensic review. At 10:41, the system sent identical alerts to legal, risk, and the external audit liaison. At 10:47, a notification went to the board's audit committee chair, flagged as a non-deferrable. Tyler still didn't know. He was too busy rebranding departments and renaming processes. The first call came at 11:12 a.m. It was Janet from legal. "Rachel," she said, her voice tight. "Did you trigger something?" "No," I replied truthfully. "The system did." Silence on the line. "Then, they're asking for documents." "All of them." "Good," I said. "Give them everything." By noon, the executive floor was buzzing. People who had swaggered in weeks earlier were suddenly whispering behind closed doors. At 12:23, the external auditors arrived unannounced. That alone should have terrified them. Auditors never show up without a reason. At 12:41, system access logs showed multiple failed attempts to override preservation locks. Tyler tried. His people tried. They couldn't. The permissions hierarchy didn't recognize his authority over continuity controls. It never had. At 1:05 p.m., the audit committee convened an emergency session. Tyler was not invited. At 1:17, the first executive was asked to explain a series of vendor payments routed through a consulting firm registered to a personal associate. At 1:34, another executive couldn't account for approval shortcuts he'd authorized under something called velocity protocols. By 2 p.m., the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't transformation. It was extraction. I watched it unfold from a distance, my phone lighting up with messages I didn't answer. At 2:18 p.m., my former assistant texted, "They're locking people out of their emails." At 2:46, security just escorted someone from finance. At 3:02, Tyler's screaming. I closed my eyes and breathed. I had warned him. I had documented everything. This was no longer personal. It was procedural. At 4:11 p.m., the board voted to suspend 19 executives pending investigation. Not symbolic suspensions. Immediate terminations. Access revoked. Cards disabled. Contracts frozen. By 4:30, security was quietly clearing offices. No shouting. No scenes. Just disbelief. At 5:04 p.m., the external auditors formally notified federal regulators. At 5:19, subpoenas were issued. At 5:47, the FBI requested system logs. The framework exported them automatically, complete with timestamps, hashes, and verification trails. The same templates I'd built years earlier. The same ones Tyler never bothered to understand. He finally called me at 6:12 p.m. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. That night, I went home, cooked dinner, and slept better than I had in weeks. By morning, the story was everywhere. Not my name. Not my resignation. The headline was about governance failures, executive misconduct, and a company saved by internal controls. That was exactly how it should be. Systems should get the credit when they work. People should only be noticed when they fail. 3 days later, I received a call from the board chair. "Rachel," she said, "we need you back." I thought about the badge I'd left on Tyler's desk. About the 15 years I'd spent being the person in the room who said no when everyone else wanted yes. On one condition, I replied. Compliance reports directly to the board. No exceptions. She didn't hesitate. Agreed. I returned to the office the following Monday. Tyler was gone. So were most of his people. The slides were gone, too, replaced by whiteboards and schedules for rebuilding. My team was waiting for me. They looked tired, but relieved. "Welcome back," someone said. I nodded. "Let's get to work." We spent the next months rebuilding what arrogance had nearly destroyed. Strengthening controls. Closing gaps. Teaching people why the boring rules mattered. Not to slow them down, but to keep them out of handcuffs. The company stabilized. The stock recovered. Employees kept their jobs. Pensions stayed funded. The system held. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not making a scene. If I wish I'd shouted, or stormed out, or made it dramatic. I don't. Power doesn't need volume. It needs preparation. Tyler thought leadership was about vision. I knew it was about responsibility. He thought compliance was an obstacle. I knew it was armor. I still carry my badge. Not as a symbol of loyalty to a company, but as a reminder of what happens when someone underestimates the quiet work. I didn't destroy anyone. I didn't seek revenge. I let the truth, properly documented, do what it always does. And it was enough. If you've ever been the person in the room no one listens to, the one who sees the risk while others chase shortcuts, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. If you found value in this story, hit like and subscribe for more real-world narratives about quiet power and earned justice. And if you want to help this story reach others who need to hear it, share it. Sometimes the most important victories happen without applause.